Welcome everyone to another episode of Notes from the Aleph. And Aleph is a high point from which all things are visible, and from our vantage point, we'll be taking a look at tabletop role-playing games, their design, and the theory behind those designs. Around here, our motto is to be fair, build up, and have fun. I'm your host, GriffinVarro, joined by our editor, Theta, our local designer, Norman Rafferty, and our good friend and GM, RedRabbit. When it comes to tabletop games, I have 15 years experience running, playing, and frequently fixing problematic rule sets at the table. Pronouns are he, him, they, them. Red, go.
All right, I'm RedRabbit. I'm a professional GM, and I'm currently running our Ironclaw game on here on the Ractus channel on Wednesday mornings. You should tune in for those. I'm also running games of 5th edition D&D, Vampire, The Masquerade 5th edition, Ironclaw, and Dungeon World, and I consider myself to be a student of narrative and game design.
And Rafferty.
Hello world, I'm Norman Rafferty, he, him from Sanguine Games. I worked as an art director at Sanguine Games and also writing some of the books, run several adventures, and we all have good bona fides.
All right. And as for today's topic, to segue into it, I rewatched Star Wars recently, and, it's the exact same Star Wars I watched last time. That's terrible. I really think the movie would have been improved if every time I watched it, Luke makes a different decision and decides to blow up the Millennium Falcon instead of the Death Star. Don't you think? So ultimately, when we play tabletop role-playing games, players have a whole bunch of different decisions. They can go off of the supposed rails of the narrative. But of course, if you're making a game, you need to have something there to do in the first place. And normally what people do is that they set up said narratives and sometimes try to attach their players directly to it in what we like to call railroading. So today, we're going to go ahead and talk about the pros and cons of having a game that follows a linear path. And who would like to go ahead and go first?
I want to say it's funny that you brought up Star Wars because they're one of the longstanding jokes in the industry is the Diana Jones Award. Have you heard of this?
I have not.
So the Diana Jones Award is supposed to give out for, humorous reasons or bad role playing or some comedy relief. I'm not sure. But the award was created when a copy of the Indiana Jones role-playing game released by TSR was burned up and put in lucite, and only the words Diana Jones were visible.
Oh. Okay.
And the Indiana Jones role-playing game was rather infamous. It was published by TSR in the 80s while they were still making between Temple of Doom and Last Crusade. So Indiana Jones was extremely relevant. This was TSR, the guys who made D&D, the world's most popular role-playing game.
Oh,
yeah. At the height of their powers, but it's infamously considered a terrible game. And it's like, well, how can the guys who made Dungeons and Dragons make a bad game? Like, why is this the worst game? These are the same guys who made Alternity. Fight me. And one of the accusations of the game is that there's nothing to it. All you do in the game is act out Raiders of the Lost Ark or Temple of Doom by going from location to location, all of which you already know because you've seen the freaking movie. I mean, they're blockbusters. Everyone had seen them.
Of course.
And so all you do is make rolls to pass certain tests, and if you fail the rolls, you just die. And so, or bad things happen to you and eventually fail. And unlike, say, a video game, which would be a test of reflexes and would give you infinite respawns or checkpoints to pass these, this is a tabletop role-playing game. You would just plow through the story you already know, hitting things where you just roll dice. And it's fascinating because, like you just pointed out with Star Wars, these movies are exciting. They have exciting storylines. People love this kind of stuff. Lots of people went to see it. Lots of people went to see it again when it was released on home video. Why?
No one complains that the book that they just read isn't different.
Sometimes they'll watch different cuts or remove stuff, but mostly they compare with the restorations, right? So, why is that? I can answer why it's necessarily bad. It's because Marshall McLuhan would talk about hot media and cold media, as in how much you have to manipulate it. Like a movie is cold; you sit there and you watch it. But a video game is hot. You have to push buttons and move the avatar on the screen. So even though an Indiana Jones video game would still have you going through the lava tunnels on carts, the fun of the game is you manipulating the character at the right moments to get through it. And in theory, like playing out a Temple of Doom movie, I mean, we all just said failure was fun in previous podcasts. Why wouldn't playing this game, but then failing things at certain moments, oh no, and he did fall off the lava cart and fell in the lava screaming. Isn't that fun? And I really, the reason why a lot of people hated that is because they felt like they didn't have any agency. They weren't allowed to make their own character. They weren't allowed to try things differently in the movie. Like they weren't allowed to dish Kate Capshaw early because they realized she was dead weight or whatever. Or make a character who wasn't like Kate Capshaw or Short Round, who have aged like milk. So,
oh dear. Yeah.
Right. So, people were saying we should do all these things, but it was, but like the designers took the challenge literally. If you wanted a Temple of Doom game, here's Temple of Doom. And so really it gets down to linearity is often considered bad. So I would take this, sure, we were using an absurd example, but get to the video game. Does anyone complain, people still play Mario World, even though it's mostly in the same order. I mean, I guess later they added the ability to play stages in different orders, but most of these games have incredibly linear paths that you get through. That's not considered bad.
I wonder how much of this has to do with the knowledge that there is a game master involved. And so, if you get bored of playing Super Mario Brothers in order over and over again, you really have no one to blame but yourself. Whereas if you sit down at a table and there's someone telling you a story and you think that their story grants you no agency, it's extra offensive because there's a living, thinking human being on the other side of the table for you to target with your frustrations, and maybe that has something to do with it.
Like related to this, when you say living human being, well, I mean that sounds unfair though, because you're supposed to be playing this to have fun. The other person on their side isn't necessarily a professional who's here to do a lot of work. I mean, people play MMOs. People tell me Final Fantasy 14 is great, but if you do the same raid a second time, it's going to be the same map with everything in the same order. Maybe the treasure will be different, but you don't. The fact that the storyline's the same all the time for everyone, including you, if you do it twice, is not something people complain about.
Right.
Why are we giving this poor person who on the other side of the table grief?
Well, because you've already been primed beforehand, I think, as we mentioned, where you're told these role-playing games can be anything. You can be anyone and do anything. And then when you sit down at the table, it is not true already. And then additionally, you have the other person there saying, you can't do that.
Let's also consider that, because we're kind of like our joke arguing here for linearity in these games, but I guess I want a better temperature read of the room. Does anyone here actually think railroading gets a bad rap? Is that what the conversation is today?
Well, the conversation today, I think, is pros and cons because it's probably not inherently bad in and of itself. Like we've mentioned, people love books, people love movies. Those go in a straight line and do not deviate.
Well, I also want to say that I think this is hilarious that you've just dropped that bomb of do few folks think linearly. I think that gaming has changed the point where, yes, linearity is considered yeah, well, I mean, it always gets back to me about dissonance, because I will invoke ads from the 1980s for Dungeons and Dragons, but they call it the worlds of your imagination, brought to you by TSR, Wizards of the Imagination. Hey, look, here are some characters in a cartoon. They're going this way. What will happen next? We don't know. It's up to you. The choices are yours. And so you'll see a lot of this advertising that says it's a theater of the mind. You can do anything. Yeah. Which all of that is the opposite of railroading, because all of that is advertising to say that, Like if you want to do something different. I don't know if you ever saw that weird CD video where it's got a video where this guy narrates, with the elf guy and the fighter guy, and the fighter says, "I want to grab the scorpion stinger and stab him with it." It's like, well, that's not covered by the rules, but as the game master, I'll let you improvise. Roll some dice to see if you can do it. Have you seen this video?
I have not, no.
I have not seen that video, but that's kind of how it
It's
plays
from the
out,
80s.
right?
Right, and in which case the video even says, like, in it, see, in a role-playing game, you can go off script and do different things that you couldn't do in a video game. Once again, these are, like, were praised as aspects of you can do something differently. And in fact, we just had earlier, we were just talking about different... in order, like when you say linearity, Red has different interpretations of Vampire the Masquerade than someone else would have as their interpretation of how a good Vampire the Masquerade works. So you've already diverged from a certain path. If you were working with published materials or published adventures, you would do them differently than someone else did. You were already nonlinear.
Yeah.
And I think Theta actually brings up a good point here, or at least over in chat. A lot of the time, even when you're running a game which is supposedly open and players making their decisions, often they are still being manipulated towards a specific end. Video games are masters of this, of making you think you have a lot of choices, but you are still going towards the one that they have already designed. When you are at the table, you are still doing this, but making people think that they always had all of the choices in front of them.
Yeah. So, okay, so I think I've got some opinions, because I do have some loaded opinions about railroading, right? I feel like if you ask any RPG player, what's the worst thing that a GM can do, they might cite a role-playing horror story from Reddit. But the second worst thing that they could possibly do is railroad an adventure, right? So I've thought a lot about this, because it's sort of like this is like a boogeyman of game masters. Game masters can do a lot of terrible things, but if you railroad your game, then you're just the worst. Or don't do that, because that's railroading. And it occurred to me that there's a lot of things that tend to fall under this heading of railroading. And so maybe this would make more sense later in the conversation if we've defined these different things a little bit better. But personally, I think that a lot of bad GMing gets labeled railroading because it's the easiest thing for a player to identify, or it's an easy label to place onto things that players are frustrated with.
Okay, well, I want to ask clarification. So what's an example of what you think is a bad GM call, but you wouldn't call it like railroading them to a certain conclusion?
Okay, so a bad GM call, well, I'm not exactly sure exactly what you're getting at, but I'll give you an example.
A lot of bad GMing is, you're saying a lot of bad GMing is labeled at railroading. Well, let's flip this around. What would be a good GM call that would also be railroading someone towards a linear conclusion? What would be a good GM call?
Okay, so a good GM call, I think, and this was also mentioned by Theta in chat, is when the party decides that they are not at all going to follow up on the clue or the lead that you have left for them. They really want to fight this dragon, but you know that they can't get past the door without the clues that they need from the riddle to solve the riddle, right? And they're going to have to get those clues from the townsfolk. In this instance that I have just invented, I think a non-railroady way to approach it would be to say, and this might not actually be the best example, but non-railroady approach would be to say, like, okay, you get there and you're faced with this riddle, like, I guess you just can't solve it. What are you going to do? Like, figure out something to do. An alternative thing that
I'll tell you right now, because this dovetails into something I was going to talk about that Griffin, Theta, and I experienced. We cast Dimension Door and go through it.
There you go. Right. So
I use Move Earth. I use Shape Stone.
Shape Stone. Perfect.
I use Teleport and appear 50 miles away from my target in a wall and die.
I think Acid Arrow will take this out, because Acid is damage over time, and it's I mean, like,
but I have Acid Vials on my person. I bought them 5 gold each over the shop in the town.
And we're specifically pulling stuff right out of the book of D&D 5.
That's very true. That's very true.
Right. No, and see, like, I'll elaborate this by saying, like, what I mean by a bad example is, I think I ran this for Griffin. I know this ran this for Theta. I ran Lost Caverns of Sajkamp, which is a D&D 1 adventure.
Okay.
So there's this center root place that in order to get into it, you have to open 6 doors. And there's a long listing next to the 6 doors saying, nothing will get through these doors. Passwall won't work. Dig will fail. Dimension doors will just fail. They resist ethereal walking. All right, that's what I mean by railroading. It's like you just said, I'm sympathetic to you, as you're saying right here. Oh, hello, Kitty. You're being sympathetic. You're saying, well, I want the players to solve this riddle, but I would take this from the opposite tack. It's like, as a player, it might be, hey, Griffin and I could memorize any spells we wanted to, and we memorized dig, shapestone, acid arrow, etc. because we didn't just want to memorize magic missile and sleep. We're bored of magic missile and sleep. I can go play an MMO and blast things with magic missile all day long. Where I'm a wizard, I want to do wizard shit. And one thing wizards could do is manipulate the environment or pass through solid objects. And now look at that. That's a solid object puzzle. I came prepared to deal with it. Now, from a railroading perspective, you might say, it's not time for you to deal with this puzzle. And therefore, you would turn to the player and say, your thing fails. Turns out this door is made of unobtainium, which resists all forms of magic. There's also an anti-magic shield. And Mistra once stepped on a puddle here and hurt her foot, so she's cursed the place, so magic doesn't work here. Blah, 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 blah. All stuff you could just say as a GM. But as a player, I would immediately feel that Indiana Jones sense of resentment. I was told I was a wizard. I was told these are spells. I was told these spells dig up dirt or move through objects. I wrote them down, and then when a situation came up in the game where I could do these things, I was told, it's not time in the story yet to do this. So in other words, I feel like I was lied to. That I feel, that I have to go and ask them questions for these riddles. All of this talk about imagination, I can do whatever I want, was a lie.
So that's interesting, right? Because I think I agree with what you're saying. But also Theta in the chat is bringing up some good points that I'm going to use. So Theta is pointing out how that's interesting because maybe railroading is a bad term. If this is railroading is bringing you to a destination. Here you are putting people in a position where you're actually blocking their progress based on what the adventure says, right? If I was going to come up with a name for that, I would call that like some sort of bad GM call, or like a denial move or something.
Bad GM. I'm calling it railroading because the story is on rails.
Yeah.
We must go to town to get the clues to the riddle, then go to this door and open it. The story is on a rail that it goes this way. If we try to go off the rails, which is a phrase for wacky stuff, if we try to go off the rails, it will fail and will be put back on the rails to do all of the story points in order. This is an example of the story is on rails. You will do everything in the exact order that you want.
Yeah. I suppose that is effectively what I'm thinking of. When I think of railroading, I think of an adventure where there's no decision points. You go and meet this person, he tells you to meet the next person. You go to meet the next person, he tells you to go meet the third person and then kill the dragon.
We're talking about the same thing. It's
essentially the same thing. Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about the same thing because you might say, well, the GM, you're thinking of railroading where the GM says, well, the player says, well, I'd like to go check out the door. No, you can't. It'd be a bad GM call of you have no free will, which is the most brute force method. I'm talking about where false choices, where it's kind of like, you just said, in fact, you just brought up that kind of thing. From the GM's perspective, GM's perspective, I have a story I want to tell, and we have a limited amount of time to do it. If you guys keep wandering off to go kill some random dragon or try to open some stupid door that you can't actually do yet because it's not time, because God has decided it's not time for you to do that, then you're just wasting everyone's time. This will not be fun. You will just fail, and it won't be. And you'll just keep asking me stupid questions about how to get to the door. It's made of unobtainium. Shut up. Get back to the story. And
I think a lot of DM decisions come from like this desire to have things go a certain way because they want to say have their scene go off the way they expected. They want to have a challenge that happens, or as we frequently say, they want the story to go along exactly as they did. So yeah, no, you can't go there yet because otherwise it'll ruin it. Is from that perspective.
And
Griff, that is exactly it. That is exactly what it is.
Bad because I'm going to go ahead and rag. I mean, I'm going to go ahead and rag on Dungeon World because, like, what really amazed me about Dungeon World is Dungeon World solved all these problems by simply removing decision making from the game.
Wow.
I mean, like if you read like Dungeon World is like streamlined D&D, but there's you can't do anything in Dungeon World in the hard rules of Dungeon World. There is nothing defined in the book other than going to the dungeon. The only definition of charisma in the book is ordering your henchmen to do things. So they don't even entertain the idea that you can do stuff. So the problem I just mentioned of trying to get through the walls, that's not a problem in Dungeon World. Those spells don't exist. We're done.
I would, if I was going to bat for Dungeon World, which I'm not because that's not the topic of this podcast, but if I were, I would say that I think Dungeon World is providing a fairly open framework and requires a lot of sort of GM responsibility. But that's my defense for a lot of these systems that I enjoy.
Well, but I mean, I have to get to the core here of like, that is a good aspect of Dungeon World. See, what I just complained about, where the book said I could do these things, but when I went to go do them, the GM said I couldn't. So now I'm mad because I spent an hour choosing my spells, and I'm mad because spells I thought would have utility don't. Dungeon World is a well-designed game, because Dungeon World didn't put those ideas in my head that I could go off the rails. Dungeon World
very surface level.
Yeah, that I mean, it's mean because I'm not saying that Dungeon World ever says in the text, don't try to go off the rails. But on the other hand, it's also like laser focused on going to a dungeon and getting stuff done. That's why a lot of people like old school games. Yeah. Because like in the old school games, they didn't have a lot of this weirdness or a lot of skills or a lot of things. Like you can't use diplomacy to undermine a situation in an old school game because diplomacy doesn't exist as a gaming concept.
Yeah.
So you can't.
For me, when I see a game like that, I see that simplicity. That's like a nice, smooth board to build your adventure onto, to build that complexity onto. But you're right. If you're just reading, if you're reading like a robot and you're going through what the book tells you to do, you will only do two things, and that is find a dungeon and go into that dungeon because that is what they've equipped you to do.
Right, and the reason why I mentioned Rozencrantz and Guildenstern is because that's Rozencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead is a movie about two people who are backup characters in Hamlet. And they've rewritten Hamlet to be told from their point of view. These are two guys who have barely any screen time, but you watch the movie of it. The movie's pretty good. It's hilarious because these two guys have no free will and no agency on what's going on. They will wander until they eventually go to England where they'll just be killed. But they do all these gimmicks to kill time while they're on their way there. They flip a coin repeatedly to make it come up heads. They have question debates. They banter with other characters who don't matter. It's hilarious, but it's also like you could play a role-playing game the same way. You could be in a game that's incredibly linear, that you're going from one spot to another, but because nothing matters, your decision process doesn't matter, you're going to a pre-programmed conclusion, you wind up getting in a lot of silly, irreverent play. And I like to use that as an example because that works great if you're playing a silly game.
That's actually very interesting, and it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, but often the people who will run things and end up doing these kind of things are very self-serious, I notice.
Well, it's the Mercer effect. It's the Mercer effect on display. Because I see, when I watch this stuff and I see the clips that people make, it's like, the actors are very entertaining, but the actors have accepted the challenge. Like, the actors are not going to waste time trying to, I want to say solve puzzles, because I'm sure eventually they'll solve a puzzle, but if they don't, they also know that if they don't solve it, the actors know their job is not to have dead air. That's their objective. Their objective is their primary objective is no dead air.
Mhm.
So they will not say, well, let's go examine this door that I have no business examining and then take up a lot of time trying to get around it, because their job was no dead air. But what I'm kind of getting at here is the bigger solution, the bigger deal with the problem is, did you tell your players that they're actors in Harmon Quest? Did you tell them that their primary mission is no dead air? Because they might have come to this game with the idea that they were allowed to play whatever character they want, and they were supposed to solve puzzles, and that these thousands of pages of supplements that they bought that teased them with special spells and feats and ancestral abilities and all this crazy stuff in it was stuff they would actually be allowed to do.
So, I think, yes.
I think that maybe comes back to an interesting thought of the false choices which were mentioned. So, in traditional kind of game design, there's usually a thing called the golden path, which is the way you're supposed to play the game. And you may have noticed a lot of games end up having like one or two endings, one where there's the good ending and the bad ending. Good thing to point out here might be, say, the Force Unleashed. Yes, that's it. Where you can either fight Vader and free the rebellion, or you can submit to him, become the next Vader, or something like that. Obviously, one of those is not preferential, but it is still a branching choice, and you could branch off at certain points.
Well,
but you're supposed to become the hero.
Notice the criticism that came out of that, because you had that period in the 2010s where people were talking about how that path doesn't happen until the very last point. Like Deus Ex Human Revolution gets a lot of shit for having the ending machine where there are 3 buttons at the end to pick an ending. There's a 4th button if you go on a side quest, but it doesn't actually happen at the end. Or Mass Effect, where people were told the entire time the bonds that you made with these NPCs would be important. Then everybody got mad when Mass Effect 3 came out, and here's you choose good or bad. Here are 2 buttons.
Right, you didn't build up to anything. Nothing before mattered until the decision that you made to choose your ending.
Right, and so these were as Theta was pointing out in the chat here. These games were touted as your choices matter. Nevia will remember this, as they would do in the Telltale game. Like, they were told their choices matter, but in the end, it was maybe one ending or maybe 2 that were like flipped at the end, and people were mad about that. And like that even goes around Red's thing of people were mad about that, and these were computer games. These weren't like, they couldn't use the excuse of it's a computer game and we didn't have a human on the other end. People were still mad.
I mean, they could still have planned it out, but I think in the interest of maybe doing something positively linear here, you can still make things matter even if you're going in the same direction. I think a little bit earlier you made the example, well, you're on rails and you have to stop in town, and then you Rozencrantz and Guildenstern it, and you just kind of have a conversation that doesn't matter with someone. As someone who's running the game, you could go ahead and say, hey, I liked this conversation you guys had. I'm going to take this character, and he's going to be further down the road for you as well. What you did now matters, even if the basic structure of the story hasn't really changed. You made a friend.
Oh,
and
no.
I think that is where maybe you can get the impression that what you do still matters, and you can still have an effect on it without drastically going somewhere else.
No, I completely agree with you that like we have degrees. Like, we're using is the extreme degree of the locked door that you can't get through until you get a key. And whereas there might be some variabilities of, did I bring this person with me? Because do we make friends along the way? And minor changes. But that's what I'm getting at, where the role-playing games will have mixed messages. Well, some of them will. Like role-playing games that are very large, like World of Darkness or Dungeons and Dragons. And by large, I mean thousands of pages with lots of special abilities. Railroading is bad, where you build a character that has lots of custom abilities and you want to use these abilities, but because the story is on rails, you do not have the agency to employ these to change the path the story is taking. You can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't change the story, which And once again, I want to repeat that because that sounds weird when you say it. You can do whatever you want, as long as it doesn't change the story.
Yep. You can do your side quests. It's okay. Now we go back to the golden path, and you're just continuing along.
I think.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I think that once again, I'm going to approach this from the perspective of like the homebrew GM versus the person who is analyzing written and published adventures, because I think that that's a different conversation. I think it's very interesting what Griff said a ways back now, because I think the heart of this issue, and maybe the reason why it stands out in my mind as such a GM crime, and so something that shows up so often, is because I think it comes from this point of view of new GMs, and sometimes established ones too, where the fun of the game for them is basically novel writing, and so they bring a predetermined story, right, what we're talking about, to the table. And I think that is something that's kind of like a hard habit to break for a lot of people, especially since that's kind of where an aspect of the fun for I think a lot of GMs comes from, is this sort of like creative control. But I think there's something very interesting about what you said too, Raph, specifically using Rozencrantz and Guildenstern as an example there, because within the context of that movie, their little side conversations, the flipping of the coin, is them establishing that they are in an artificial world. They're realizing that they are bit players who, through destiny, through forces outside of their control, will never escape what's going to happen to them. And so they start to screw around. And ultimately, I think that's interesting because that parallels the whole murder hobo conversation. This idea that players become bad actors and become destructive in these, and try to actively disrupt these larger narratives that people bring to the table because of a sense of futility in the face of realizing this is all artificial.
Right.
And that is something I didn't realize, but I think is really, really strong.
I'm glad you brought that up, because like earlier it was said that failure is fun, and I'm not a big fan of that. Emergence is fun. The idea that we did something and something in the world happened because of something we did. Like I swung my sword and fumbled and cut off my own foot is because of a bad roll, or that guy rolled a 1, that person rolled a 20 on their diplomacy check and seduced the bear. It wasn't they walked up and seduced the bear, they rolled a 20 and seduced the bear. That's what makes it funny. Haha, they rolled so high it had to happen. That's emergence.
We've taken agency away from the storyteller to do something that flies in the face of his tone and intentions.
Well, that's a mean way of saying it. I think a more positive way of saying it is I was invited to a role-playing game. You didn't ask me to read your novel. You asked me to sit at the table and do some improv today. And my improv today was I'm going to seduce a bear, or I'm going to open a door.
Right. Now, not to say that in this example the GM is in the right. I think the person seducing the bear definitely has been driven to that point via linearity.
Or they just want to see something funny happen. I mean, that's why I put Dungeon World on the spot, because once again, rules light games don't have this problem as much, because the game isn't prompting the player to do things. Like I always say, rules endorse behavior. I wouldn't think of using an acid arrow to melt a door if the game didn't put melts acid arrow in front of me, right there as an option.
And I wanted to can be used to melt objects.
Right. I wanted to fly. The game said no. Flying is 3rd level. Acid arrow is 1st level. So you have to have acid arrow before you can fly. So I took acid arrow, and now that I have an opportunity, that's why I was phrasing this in the flavor of the players. When you play a role-playing game, you don't let the players do whatever they want. They can't show up with Batman or Twilight Sparkle or Deadpool. We're playing D&D today. You only can do what's in the book that we said you could do. Maybe we have some house rules, you can play a Tabaxi or a Kobold, but you can't do anything you want. You can't throw fireballs. That's 3rd level. You have to wait till your 5th level. In other words, you put rules in front of people, that said that they had to make choices. So as a compromise, instead of doing anything, they sat down and went through the book and did these things. Then later, when you're in the game and those circumstances show up where, hey, you said I could use these tools to do things. You said that I could play a chaotic good a half-elven wizard who could do these sorts of things in a game. I told you my backstory and my part of the story. Good improv would be that when I try to do something, the GM responds with yes and makes things move forward. Now we're seeing in railroading, we're seeing no instead of yes. You can't do this because we're not ready in the story. And once again, that wouldn't be a problem in the Mercer effect. If you told the players in advance, you are all going to be actors in my story, I'm going to let you have fun with it and go ahead and, you can change certain things. But, I mean, did at any point you turn to the players and say, but we're going to follow a critical path storyline that I dictate? Did you ever tell them that?
Right. It's important, of course, to have everyone at the table know what's going on. And, of course, remember that there's cooperative storytelling going on in improv. And if everyone is already in on the idea that they're going to be writing some part of their story, and you just constantly tell them no, it's immediately just not fun. Unless you tell them what's up.
So we are in agreement then there are certain ways that we have those conversations where very few RPGs are truly just free, do whatever you want. Whether it's informed by the powers in the book or by the understanding that we're running a pre-made one-shot adventure that we only have 4 hours to do it in, and if you want to beat the bad guy, you're going to have to stick to this critical path. Then that is...
I can't. You made the blanket statement of saying very few. I can't agree to that. I think,
few. What? Sorry, I lost track of what I was saying.
All right. I think if you read the text of role-playing games, I don't think there's any of them. There are very few role-playing games like Fiasco that will just tell you, okay, you are on a storyline. You need to get through the critical path as fast as possible, and the players are improv actors. What I just said out loud. We're going to do a story. It's going to be a critical path. You're allowed to have fun with it, do some improv thing, but we'll go on the story. I don't think there's any role-playing game that just flat out says that. In fact, I'm arguing that there are many role-playing games that will tell you the opposite. If you read the introduction to Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, they'll talk about how you're supposed to improv stuff. Also, they don't sell you, the ultimate martial guide and say, by the way, the GM should feel free to veto everything in this book if it violates the critical path. Ask your GM permission before using any of this. They don't say that. They want you to buy the book.
Yeah,
of course.
Yeah.
So, I don't agree that there's many role-playing games that say that to folks.
Maybe not explicitly, then.
Well,
but I do think that there are implicit. Well,
I would agree with you that it's implicit. Yeah. But the problem I'm getting at here is is that
we need to be explicit.
Well, I mean, Brad, you already pointed out, should we go by the published adventures? I can quote several published adventures that have a critical path that you're forced to go on, the way it's written, that you have to do everything in order.
Yeah.
But like I said, nothing in the text is going to tell you, if your player, very few exceptions. I think Boldvay's D&D does have a sidebar that says if your players delay the game, feel free to have a dragon attack them. And we're going back to the 80s for that. That was in the days of die with a bad saving throw. When examples of play killed players, which we also got away from. Nothing in the book says kill all your PCs. But on the other hand, you play a D&D adventure, it's okay, if you get into combat and get reduced to negative hit points, you could die. And if you're dead at first level, you're dead. Nothing's bringing you back.
Yeah.
It doesn't say in the game player death will be a constant, persistent menace, especially early in the game. It is, but they don't talk about that. Nowhere in the book are they going to tell you, player. And I'm guessing what I'm saying is the thing that Theta brought up is you already brought this up, Red. It's going to turn your players into murder hobos. They're going to know at some point to that because we fail forward on the railroad, because we're eventually going to get to the end of it, they're going to lose. Some players, if they figure this out, are going to lose interest. Not all of your players will figure this out. Some of your players are along for the ride and are riveted to the story and don't know what's going to happen next. Yeah. Because there are some, not every movie is predictable to everybody. But if players figure this out, and you'll get toxic behavior when players figure this out. players will start. This is what I'm really worried about. Players will start to realize that there are traps in the game. The dig spell is a trap because if I take it as a spell instead of second level spell, I think it's acid arrow or burning hands. It's going to blow up in my face because the GM's going to tell me it doesn't work on the one thing I wanted it to work on. So utility spells are a waste of my time. I should only be taking stuff that matters in combat because combat is when I have agency.
Yeah.
And then you wind up with, like you said, the murder tourists. It's the players will start to realize there's no point in taking anything soft that might actually let me, there's no point in taking a charm spell because the GM will just make it blow up in my face and not let me solve a problem if the guard doesn't want to let me in and that's part of a puzzle, that's not going to work. So don't take anything that's not going to work. Just take only stuff we know is going to work. And then you basically inculcated your players into not having, the idea that they have emergence, and you'll wind up, and your game will run a lot better because any player who wanted emergence won't show up anymore.
Right. And as you mentioned, rules enforce behavior or endorse behavior. And if you have a GM who has their own set of rules of how things should go, then that's the behavior they start endorsing.
My one of my many GM embarrassments was the one time a player of mine took the divination spell, the Wheel or Woe one, and used it. And one of the options is so wheel, something good happens, woe, something bad happens, or you can say wheel and woe.
Yeah,
which is what I did. Yeah, which is basically like, hey, go fuck yourself. Is basically the answer. Is like that spell you just cast didn't fucking matter. Yeah, and I did that, and I looked back on it, and in my mind I was like, oh well, something's gonna ambush them tonight, but that's gonna lead them to a cave where there's some treasure. So good and bad. But then I realized after the fact this is terrible. So what's the solution there? How do you encourage people to use the rules in a way that does not discourage?
Well, I'm gonna rag on that. The one solution is you first of all don't put anything in the game you don't expect players to use. Like I have the big reason I have big issues about D&D 5 and D&D 3 is that they have spells in them like augury, which are trapped. Because if you buy these spells, or like legend lore is my favorite because legend lore just tell you where someone is, or detect. That's why everyone's got amulets of non-detection or whatever because there's spells to teleport. Any of those spells that fix all of the problems, either they'll show up in the game and the GM will cast them, or the players will cast them and they fix all the problems, and the GM will get frustrated. This is why you have the E7 movement where people say, we just stop the game at 7th level. After that, it's no fun. That's a design problem of the game. The game could be fun at level 20, but these spells, because players take them. Or you'll have the other GMs who will just make those spells useless and make them not work. In which case, the only players that hang around are the players who only cast Disintegrate now, because nothing else is going to solve my problem. That's. I know it's left-handed praise, but like a game like Dungeon World solves that problem by not putting those in the book.
Yeah.
D&D 4 always gets credit for being anti-role play, but if you look at D&D 4, they got rid of like augury and divination and pass wall and all of those spells that break the game. And they replaced them with other spells, such as one where you have to hand draw a gate, and you can only teleport to gates that have been hand drawn, which turns this from teleport anywhere in the world with a single word to I need to do a ritual. I can only go to places I've pre-programmed.
Yeah.
Right, so you do it back in town, and then you go do your adventure, and then you teleport back to town. It's like, that would still be useful.
Yeah, their divination spell is a phantasmal hand. So you can summon a hand and ask the hand questions, and it can do anything that a single hand could gesture, like 1, 2, or 3, or yes, or no, or point a certain direction. Okay, now it's an interesting spell, because if I cast that and ask, which way we should go, it would point a certain direction, or should I do this? It might say, it might shrug, but it's a hand, so it can do hand gestures and point certain ways, or do or give a little more evocative instead of nothing. Yeah. But they got rid of that because everyone says, D&D 4 is bad.
Yeah. So really what they're doing there is they're mechanizing an otherwise ephemeral mechanic or power, right? If the power is just to learn what the future holds, that's antithetical to drama. That kills your mystery and your riddle. But if you can represent that in a way that has built-in limitations, like with the hand thing, I think that's a very clever solution.
Yeah,
I mean, like, there's a whole bunch of stories about there where the future's coming, and well, good luck with that.
yeah.
But I think a lot of it is definitely that people don't understand the externalities of like the abstractness, which is probably why it's good to mechanize it, because then it's very clear what it's doing, and you don't have to be confused all the time.
Right. I mean, it's this weird like if the game is supposed to be, if the players are only supposed to have so much agency, then we can't. Then the first thing to do would be, that's a problem with bad game design. Like I said, it's this thing that annoys me where the game told you could do these things. And when you get to the table, the novel writer wanted to railroad, which is not a rule. Nowhere in the book does it say you should be railroading people. Doesn't say you can't, but doesn't say you should. And then the player took these tools and tried to use them, but they were told not to. Is that the player's fault because the book told them to do that? Is that the GM's fault because they're forcing the player to take one path instead of others and being anti-improv? Or is that the game's fault because the game told them they could violate space and time to solve their problem?
Yeah, and I know
blame the
we
game.
know where you. Yeah, we know where you fall on the topic, and I think that's fair. I think game design is important. This is why we have a podcast and we talk about this stuff.
I did have another solution, which is, but the other thing I point out, and you're going to hate this, is like, always side with the player. Fuck this stupid critical path. Critical path is an arbitrary restriction imposed by people who want to write a novel, and we did not come for a novel today. We came for a game. You want to write a novel, you write a novel. I'm going to be angry with this because there is one company that has consistently given the middle finger to railroading, and that is freaking Palladium.
Ooh, do tell.
If you read a Palladium adventure, they are not linear. None of them are, and they've written dozens. Palladium is a fantasy game called Palladium Role Playing, which is just fantasy. They have Rifts, which is the one you've heard of, which is Gonzo Crazy. They've published Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle Adventures, which are a bit more restrained. They've published not Mercenary Spies, Spies and they published a bunch of stuff, but none of their adventures are written in a linear fashion.
Yeah.
Right, and I was about to mention that at least on the GM side, since you're the one controlling the story, you could maybe prepare in certain ways for unexpected lack of linearity. But how does Palladium do it? What does it do in the way it designs its adventures that promotes this?
It's probably better to talk about how things like Power by the Apocalypse do it. But Palladium first took the approach that the world is filled with other entities who want to get stuff done. See, D&D often takes the approach that there's a box that has monsters in it, and the monsters have all the food and water they need and will wait patiently for you to open this box for you to kill them. And that's why D&D gets a reputation for being linear, because it's like a computer game. In Palladium or PvP, they might call them fronts or other characters. They usually have some objective, like the raiders want to come and eat your face, or the cultists want to cast a spell that destroys the world, or the colony ship crashed and the survivors only have this much food and water left. Every moment we delay is a moment some of them die. So you make it, in a good game, you make it clear that there's a timeline of stuff going on. Then the players realize, okay, we have to do something. And most obvious thing would be to go right there and deal with it. So if we dick around, you have to make it clear to the players that while you're dicking around, other shit is going on. Instead of in a railroaded plot, either players dick around and the clock doesn't advance because it's a computer game, and sure, Skyrim's under attack by an evil dragon, but I'm going to do 100 hours of side quests. Who gives a shit? Or you don't allow people to dick around at all. It's like, I know you want to do something that's fun and interesting for you, but we're not about fun. We're about my story. I know I'm being mean today, but I'm being mean about it. Instead,
this is good, because I think those two characteristics are, I think, the suggestions that I would have made, which is have a timeline and make sure NPCs have agency. The villain who stays at home eating chips on the couch isn't your villain. Well,
see, they got rid of they used to have that in computer games. You go play Fallout 2, and Fallout 2 says your colony needs a new purifier in 200 days or everyone dies. And go. It's not linear. You go out and do that. Fallout 3 doesn't do that. Fallout 3 is, the whole quest line of finding Liam Neeson will wait patiently for you no matter how long you take to get there. And that's why we're making fun of Mass Effect. It wasn't, we only have, 100 days to stop the Reaper Reapers. Because they were because players would be confused. You told me I could do side quests. I want to go do. I want to be like that's the opposite. That's non-linear to a fault. You told me I could fuck around and do all this other shit, while I was getting there. So that's why they had to make their non-linear at the end. But you're a tabletop game. You don't have to be bound to that. You can just tell the players the bad end happens unless you stop it. And that's the way a lot of Palladium adventures are written, and that's the way a lot of the PBTA invokes the clock motif, which is if you don't stop this, something will happen. And then you actually have to have players give a care about it. And then make them care. And that's why I'm blaming the computer games, because Grand Theft Auto and all these other quest games came out that told you something's important at the end of it, but don't worry, you can dick around for 100 hours until it actually happens. And then you get to the tabletop, and the tabletop says you can't even dick around for 100 hours. You only have one story, and you have to do exactly what I said. And that just strikes me as incredibly reductive when role-playing games, like Red said, aren't moderated by a computer game. In theory, I have another person at the table that can interpret all my weird stuff any way I want. By the way, we're not going to do that.
Yeah. I think the clock is actually another good thing to kind of point out here in terms of designing stories, where you don't necessarily have to have a binary, the story is over once you reach the time limit. There can be phases. Things could get progressively worse. You could go ahead and say, well, I'll go ahead and wait until things actually get really bad. So you don't have to end of the story just once a villain accomplishes their goal. The story can go on, just that now they're in a winning position already.
Well, or speaking of the ultimate dick move, when we're doing the Tyrant Queen adventure for D&D 5, it's like the evil Tyrant Queen has come. And we just said, well, our entire party is aligned evil because you said we could be, and we all are. So, hooray.
Hooray. That's good for us.
Yeah, there you go. You got a brand new world that exactly as you wanted.
Except the way Tyrant Queen is written and presented, you have absolutely no choice. This is why I keep bragging on that of like, no, you have no choice. You will stop the Tyrant Queen. It's considered a bad thing. Even though we also said in another section of the book, you can be evil.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that comes back to not being contradictory and making sure everyone's above board with what game is going to be played.
Yeah, I think a part of it is definitely setting that up and making people aware of where they will and won't have agency. I think a bigger part of it comes from this idea of designing your adventures as settings with built-in conflict rather than as stories that you expect to play out. Because I do think that people sense that when you are just presenting a story that has an obvious conclusion that they're expected to play a part in, and that is where they will start to feel trapped by it.
Yeah.
I also like games. I also very much like games where the mechanics create that pressure and drama, like we mentioned, with clocks, with fronts. Like, those are those kinds of things that stand out to me because it's a strangely novel idea when you compare it to the D&D formula, which expects you to do all of that intuitively.
Another thing I want to touch on is they also expect, speaking of the all evil party, they also expect that NPCs will always do the exact same thing. This shows up sometimes in the Vampire the Masquerade and published adventures where you meet an NPC, they've already made up their mind, and they're going to do this. So they just order you to do this, or they hate you. There's nothing you can do to sway them. It's like there's one published D&D adventure we were on where we're in the desert and we encountered a dryad. Dryad is a creature that needs a tree to survive. There's a tree here. It's a water spring in the middle of a desert. So that's not the illogical problem. But we just approached this character saying, look, we're not stopping here. We have somewhere to be. You are just one encounter on a long list. You're an intelligent being that speaks the same language we do. We don't want to kill you. Yeah. You don't want to fight us because we will burn this whole place to the ground.
You and your one tree.
We are a party that is 4 Dragonborns, and she has a flaming sword. Do not fuck with us.
That is a good
Right.
a red flag, right? When you're setting up a situation and your players are trying to sort of like logic or talk their way out of it, but their arguments make a lot of sense, that's when you know that there's been a flaw here and that you should probably let them go along with it.
Right.
Sometimes they won't. Sometimes their logic will be batshit
And-
bananas and would never work.
Well,
But if it starts to make sense.
Yeah, but what I'm getting at here is we're all in agreement that a good GM would recognize this as a parlay encounter that we could, we just said, look, lady, we just want to go through, not touching anything.
Yeah.
And like any reasonable person would get with that. But I want to emphasize that nothing in the text implies that this is even an option.
And this is where the game design would come into play, where you could put the label on.
Right, that's where I'm getting mad at the game designers, because there's more than one encounter. A big bug I have them about is Pathfinder often publishes adventures where they have a programmed combat encounter where and this is something you can like almost never do. They have a bad guy show up, get into a fight with the players, and then they assume that the bad guy will win and or get away.
Yeah.
Which is not something you can assume in almost any role-playing game published. Because, and not only that, but the problem is if you have to cheat for this to happen, now remember I was complaining that players will discover that soft abilities like diplomacy or stealth or weird spells won't work if they're on the critical path. If you break kayfabe here and show the players, by the way, you can win or lose a combat because I'm willing to lie about it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Some of your players are going to have their minds blown by that. I say some because I've met some GMs who I swear their players either never figure this out or don't care. There are probably some players out there who were totally on board with railroading, totally on board being entertained today, and totally on board with just experiencing the play as they get it. And I'm not saying everyone's like this.
So many people are trained by video games, and you guys already mentioned several great examples, right, of how you play the anime RPG, and the very first time you fight the villain, you beat them, and then you lose anyway in the cutscene. It's almost cartoonish, but if that's your exposure, then there's going to be a lot of people who just expect that's how these things go. That's just
there'll be GMs who have seen that.
And expect it
because you'll emulate what you've seen and what you like.
Yeah,
I can't emphasize enough that a lot of what happens in modern tabletop role-playing games is because of what people have seen in computer games. Increasingly more, like the entire idea that we would have to say like that railroad, the entire idea of railroading might be bad, being controversial, is totally from video games. Because if you go back and read like the old school games, like one of my favorites is the whole adventure against the giants, the one that culminates in going to the Drow spaceship. They mention in the sidebar in the original adventure, if you just want to burn the entire giant's house down, you can do that. It's a little sidebar that says it's extremely difficult because it's wet wood, it's hard to catch. They'll come out and try to stop you. But they at least realized you might just want to burn down the entire building rather than go inside, because your mission is to kill all the giants, and it'd be way easier if you just burn down the building.
It'd be way easier to do a guerrilla campaign where you take them out one by one in the night, slowly causing them to fall into madness. But, I don't think anyone plans for that.
Oh, well, that's a problem because there's wandering monsters, because we tried that. But that's kind of what I'm getting at, is like a modern video game person would go, that's a wall. That's indestructible. You can't destroy walls. Everyone knows walls can't be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
We're
arguing about how to kill fruit right now.
What do you got, Red?
I feel like I'm often on the other side of the argument, of Rafferty's argument, anti-module design argument, where it's like these should be designed better. But this conversation has reminded me of or honest to God, WotC published adventure in the Candlekeep Mysteries book that is possibly the worst thing that I've ever read. But it drives me crazy. It is I've wanted to write a blog post about this. It's the lore of Lurue. It's one of the adventures in the Candlekeep Mysteries book. It's about a book with a unicorn on it. in it you get teleported into a magical illusory demi-plane of this historical event that took place. And the very first thing they tell you as your party gets sucked into the book is that if you try to walk away from the forest where the stuff goes down, you hit a literal invisible wall. They find they can't go any further. And the adventure goes on to include
finally
things.
Put you in the DM's narrative.
They finally recreated all of the worst parts of video games in a role-playing game. Like, there's no consequence for death. You pop out of the book, you get a free full heal, and then you jump right back into where you left off. It is a nightmare. It's a nightmare thesis, unlike what some people think that this game should be based on video games.
Right. And that's why, that's why, as the old person, I mean, that's why I'm the opposite. As the old gray-haired person here, it's kind of like, old man yells at video game. It's like, if that's what the role-playing games should mimic what people actually want to do. Mm-hmm. And I this new thing of Mercer Effect role-playing games of where, players are actors and they have some improv ability, but mostly what the experience is supposed to be in them demonstrating what they're doing. I don't have a problem with that, but the issue is that I think we need a game that works with that. Like recently we streamed Wicked Ones, and Wicked Ones has a lot of provisions in the game for rewarding you for acting out or specifically indulging the kind of terrible person that you are, because it's a wicked game. So I didn't feel as bad about that game being very linear, where they say, okay, here's the caper you're going to do today, and then we go do it. I didn't feel bad about that, because the objective is, how can I make everyone's life miserable while doing it?
That wasn't the point.
But
you still
even
had
then,
agency.
we chose the caper we went on in the first place.
And it wasn't just agency. I recognize that. I mean, one of the reasons why Ironclaw and the rest of those games have goals is because we wanted to be extremely upfront to players and telling them, this is what we're doing today. You can't complain that players are going off the rails if you never told them where we were going.
Right.
And I think that's a big point. When they said, okay, here we are in town. Oh, cool. I'm going to go run off and go to the bars and pick random pockets. No, you're not supposed to do that. We're here to provision for the adventure. Did you tell them that? Did you tell them that loudly? Did you tell them to write that on their sheet as a quest goal and told them they get experience points if they do that?
Yeah.
Because they're pretty sure that if they go pick random pockets, they'll get money, and money is a different kind of reward. I mean, that's what I'm kind of getting at here, which is we need to we can make the tools we have work for what we want to do, but we should instead have brought the right tools to the job in the first place.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and get in some last words then. Red, what do you got?
I guess coming away from this, I think this was a good talk. I'm trying to figure out what can you use from this, right, to write better stories and to make this stuff work better. Like, what kind of design do we need to see more of? And so I think that these adventures need to be approached in less of a story set piece fashion and more of a setting the stage kind of fashion. I think the published adventures I have seen that do things similar to this, they're really just laying out a world, a region, characters that inhabit that region, and a conflict that these characters find themselves in. And that's probably a healthier mindset than telling people hey, you could write a story where epic adventurers slay a dragon. Because if that's how you're going in, you're going to be subconsciously pushing people towards that end, and that's where it all starts to unravel. So yeah, that's where my head's at.
Yeah.
Right, Rafferty.
Last
words.
I want to say that after hearing some of the stuff, I know I came into this rolling bad. I think there's something to be said for people doing what they're supposed to do in the game. I think the issue here, I would say, with railroading is we need to answer the question, what are we supposed to be doing? And so that way we can answer the question of whether where one person's bad actor is another person's seeking emergence and fun. So once we start to define what that is, I think we're all in agreement that we need to set that framework up, and I think we need to be honest about it. We also decide what we're doing. Like I said, I don't necessarily mind that we're doing a narrative that flows in one direction. But the reason why people were complaining about the Mercer effect is because they never told they didn't tell the players, you're actors and I'm the director. You are restrained by all of this. I think we need to examine what makes these things fun and what doesn't. And most importantly, we need to make sure that the games work that way. You know me, I'm not a fan of like when players make choices that were inspired by the game's writing itself. We need to work with the player to help them understand what we wanted to do that wasn't necessarily what the game wanted them to do. And of course, I would also say we should start picking games to do what we want.
Right, definitely. All right, then. So for today, that's going to be all for Notes for the Aleph. We stream bi-weekly Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. You can come join us live at twitch.tv/Ractus. We also stream and record weekly tabletop games at the same channel, and you can come join us when we start at 10 a.m., 2 p.m., and 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Sundays and Wednesdays. Norman Rafferty here is our partner and writer at Sanguine Games. Check out sanguinegames.com and join us on the Reddit and Twitter, and look forward to the upcoming Book of Horrors Ironclaw expansion book, where you can engage your own pirate adventures. Don't forget to check out RedRabbit and Book of Her Game over on startplayinggames.com as Oracular Pig. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and come see us all again. Until next time, everybody. Goodbye. All right. And
Yeah, I would feel
that will be a wrap.
I always feel like the big
Awesome.